April 1943, Camp Hereford, Texas. Serente Joseph Morelli's hand shook as he wrote a letter home, the pencil barely steady. That letter would take 8 months to reach his mother in Sicily. He wrote things he'd never have believed just weeks before. "Mama, they feed us like guests here, not prisoners. White bread every day, meat, vegetables, more food than we saw in 2 years of war. I don't understand these Americans." He looked out the barracks window. Electric lights blazed across the Texas plains. Tractors rumbled through the fields. American guards leaned on fences, sharing cigarettes with Italian prisoners. Everything he saw flew in the face of Mussolini's propaganda. Italy was supposed to be building a new Roman Empire. America was supposed to be weak, falling apart from within. But here, in captivity, Italian soldiers found a kind of abundance they'd never imagined. When the first Italian prisoners arrived at Camp Hereford that April, they joined about 51,000 other Italian POWs who would end up in America. The first Italians had landed in the U.S. back in November 1942 after the Allies invaded North Africa. These men surrendered in Tunisia when General Giovanni Messi's army finally broke. Months with no supplies, no hope, they braced for the worst. Hard labor, beatings, maybe even death. What they found instead, and what thousands would later write home about, was something closer to a strange comfort. Defeat in Tunisia came fast. After years of fighting through North African deserts, the Italians hit a wall. No supplies from home. The Germans treated them like cannon fodder. British and American troops closed in from both sides. By May 1943, about 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, and 50,000 of them were Italians. These North African prisoners became the heart of the 51,000 Italians who would eventually fill American camps, joined by others captured in Sicily and mainland Italy. Their journey from defeat to discovery started in the Tunisian collection camps. American efficiency shocked the Italians. They got real medical checkups, some for the first time in years. New clothes replaced their ragged uniforms, but what really stunned them was the food. After months of scraping by on crusts and scraps, the Americans handed out white bread, canned meat, coffee with sugar, even chocolate. The Liberty ships that hauled them across the Atlantic had just finished dropping off supplies in Europe. Rather than sail back empty, they loaded up with POWs, sometimes 30,000 a month. By the summer of 1943, that 2-week voyage shattered everything the Italians thought they knew about the enemy. The ships themselves felt like factories afloat, cranked out faster than anything Italy could dream of. Radar equipment, something Italians had only seen on fancy British warships, came standard on American freighters. But the real shock? The mess halls. American sailors had ice cream machines, coffee on tap, fresh bread, meat, fruit, every day. They tossed leftovers in the trash. Food the Italians would have fought over back home just got scraped into the bin. This wasn't just plenty. It was excess they couldn't wrap their minds around. When the Italians got off the ships at places like Norfolk or out on the West Coast, the surprises kept coming. The ports sprawled for miles. Docks, cranes, warehouses, ships everywhere. Electric cranes did the work of dozens of men. But what really hit them was the civilian life. Huge parking lots packed with cars. In Italy, only the rich drove. Here, everyone seemed to have one. Every building glowed with electric lights. Shops offered goods the Italians hadn't seen since before the war. And the way they traveled. Passenger trains with cushioned seats, electric lights, real dining cars, not cattle cars, not misery. Town after town rolled by outside the windows, each with electricity, cars, shops full of food and goods. Factories ran day and night. Even remote farms had tractors and electric lines. Camp Hereford was set aside just for Italians. Others, like Camp Hereford, held mostly German prisoners. Hereford was big, 4 compounds, barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, all surrounded by barbed wire and guards. At its peak, the camp held 3,860 prisoners, 2,580 of them Italian. It became one of the main hubs for Italian POWs in Texas, but the camps, they were better than anything the Italian army had ever put together. Barracks had electric lights, hot showers, flush toilets, heating. The hospitals had equipment they hadn't seen in years, X-ray machines, modern surgery tools. To the Italians, these camps felt almost like paradise. There were definitely cases of mistreatment, especially toward the NS, but for the most part, they lived in clean barracks, took hot showers, and always had plenty to eat. They could even spend the money they earned at the local PX. The food alone amazed them. 3 meals every day, always with meat, vegetables, bread, milk, and often dessert. Holidays meant special meals that beat anything they'd ever had, even before the war. The kitchen crews sometimes threw out more food daily than their families back in Italy got in a week. Everything flipped on September 8, 1943, when Italy surrendered and signed an armistice with the Allies. Marshal Pietro Badoglio's government switched sides and declared war on Germany just a month later on October 13th. After the surrender, the Italian Prime Minister told Italian PSWs to work with the Allies. In February 1944, the U.S. Army Service Corps gave Italian PS in America a choice: stay prisoners or volunteer for the Italian Service Units, ISU, working with Americans in non-combat jobs. The response? Huge. Out of 51,000 Italians held in the U.S., over 45,000 joined the service units and got sent all over the country to fill labor shortages. They pledged to help fight their former German allies and got new privileges that completely changed their lives. Technically, they were still classified as POWs, but they wore uniforms marked only by a patch reading Italy on the left sleeve and garrison cap. They got a monthly stipend of 24. Only a third was paid in cash. The rest came as scrip, usable at the base for supplies and personal items. California was different. With the war in the Pacific still raging, Italian PS working there found a warm welcome, especially from the state's big Italian-American community. These families, rooted since the gold rush as fishermen, farmers, and winemakers, embraced the POWs. The best story came from Angel Island, where Italian PS used their earnings to rent a dance hall in San Francisco. They threw Saturday night dances that turned into major local events. American women came, chaperoned but eager to meet the Italian soldiers. Italian POWs worked in California's fields, totally taken aback by the scale. Farms were the size of Italian provinces. Mechanical harvesters did work that would have taken hundreds of men. ISU members became essential. They loaded ships for D-Day, harvested crops that would have rotted otherwise, and kept military equipment running with skills they'd picked up in North Africa. The Italian service units racked up over 90 million man-days of labor in the U.S. between 1943 and 1945, saving the government around 230 million. At the Brooklyn Army Terminal, Italian POWs loaded supplies headed for the liberation of Europe, working hard because every shipment meant Italy was one step closer to freedom from Germany. Out in the agricultural regions, they saved harvests that were crucial to feeding America and its allies. By June 1943, more than 4,500 Italian PS lived in camps across America. After Italy's surrender, the program got even bigger, and these workers became vital in all kinds of fields, and love stories blossomed even though the odds were stacked against them. Italian POWs met American women at church, at social events, and on the job. In Ogden, Utah, a local church held chaperone dances every weekend, and Italian-American families could visit the POWs on Sundays. But military rules banned marriages between POWs and Americans. Even so, romance found a way. Priests, sympathetic to the couples, held secret ceremonies. Some couples wrote letters back and forth for months, and many American women followed their Italian sweethearts to Italy after repatriation, married there, and later returned to America as wives of legal immigrants. The Italian-American community made a huge difference wherever there were a lot of Italians. POWs found surrogate families who brought them home for Sunday dinner, helped them write letters to Italy, and kept friendships going long after the war ended. Christmas 1943 hit especially hard. American churches and local groups sent care packages to the camps with cigarettes, chocolate, and toiletries. Luxuries even for Americans back then. Local communities organized big dinners and celebrations, making sure the POWs didn't feel forgotten. At Camp Hereford, the local churches filled the air with Italian Christmas carols. Catholic parishes held midnight mass, not just in Latin, but in Italian too. The Christmas feast? It was a spread. Turkey, ham, all sorts of side dishes, desserts piled high. For the Italian prisoners, it felt like a kind of abundance they hadn't seen since before World War I. This wave of kindness toward former enemies completely broke apart the old fascist propaganda about so-called American weakness. Italian POWs wrote home, telling their families about American generosity. They said only a nation sure of victory could afford to be this open-handed. By 1944, thousands of them signed up for classes. They learned English, pored over American history, crunched through mathematics, and picked up vocational skills. Universities sent in correspondence courses. Camps screened Hollywood films and printed newspapers. These papers started as simple news sheets, but quickly grew into lively publications full of debates about democracy and dreams for life after the war. Italian POWs got creative. They built theaters, started orchestras, and made art. Some of it still survives. In several camps, they built fountains, painted murals, and constructed chapels that people still visit today. This wasn't just busy work. It was real craftsmanship, proof of their Italian artistic roots. When news of the Normandy invasion hit the camps on June 6, 1944, Italians went wild with celebration. Sure, these were their old enemies landing in France, but they were also the liberators who would finally drive the Germans out of Italy. Italian POWs volunteered for extra shifts, loading supplies and scrawling defiant messages on boxes. For the liberation of Rome, death to the Nazis. When Rome fell just 2 days before, on June 4th, Italians and Italian-Americans in the U.S. threw joint celebrations. Former enemies were now fighting side by side against Nazi Germany. At Camp Hereford, prisoners and locals packed out a victory mass. Thousands showed up. All throughout captivity, the Italian POWs experienced real American kindness. When prisoners got word their families had died in bombings back home, American guards and commanders came to their memorial services. Local families opened their homes to prisoners who'd lost everything, making sure they weren't alone. Especially during the holidays, medical care made a huge impression. Italian doctors worked right alongside American staff, learning new techniques and using equipment they'd never seen back home. Prisoners got surgeries and treatments that, in Italy, only the wealthy could afford. After Italy surrendered, the split between German and Italian prisoners became obvious. While German POWs mostly clung to Nazi beliefs, Italians embraced their new role as co-belligerents and threw themselves into Allied work. In March 1944, the U.S. military sent 1,800 Italian service unit members to Boston. At first, the prisoners stayed at Camp McKay in South Boston, where the locals treated them coldly. The city's Italian Americans were suspicious, worried the POWs would tarnish their reputation as loyal citizens. But things changed quickly. The Italians proved themselves hardworking at the Boston port, sang in church choirs, cooked for festivals, and introduced authentic Italian food to second-generation Italian Americans, many of whom had never tasted the real thing. Tensions with the South Boston community eventually led to 1,300 of the men moving to Pedex Island in Boston Harbor. Life there was more relaxed. Trustees could take Sunday boat trips into Boston's North End and often ate dinner with Italian-American families. Everywhere they went, Italian POWs saw American industry and farming on a scale they couldn't believe. In California's Central Valley, one farm could outproduce entire provinces back home. Machines harvested crops in hours, work that would have taken weeks in Italy. They watched perfect fruit tossed away just for a blemish. Sometimes entire harvests were plowed under just to keep prices up. It was waste on a scale that would have meant survival in Italy, but here it just showed the country's bottomless reserves. What really stunned them was how casual Americans were about all this abundance. Workers tossed half-eaten lunches, left lights on in empty rooms, and drove cars to work, luxuries unthinkable in wartime Italy, where families barely scraped by. The men worked in fields or on fishing boats, earning $8 a month. Even that modest wage felt generous to men who started with nothing, and they saved every penny for their families back home. Italian POWs left their mark on American culture. They introduced bocce ball to communities that still play it. They taught Americans how to make real pasta and pizza, helping launch what would become a massive industry. Their fountains, murals, and chapels still stand in dozens of places. Camp newspapers written by the prisoners themselves changed just like their writers did, shifting from news about Italy to lively debates about democracy, American agriculture, and rebuilding Europe. After the war, publications moved through the camps, sparking conversations about democracy and modern ideas. On July 16, 1944, the 38th and 40th Italian Quartermaster Services Companies rolled into Rock Island Arsenal by train, all the way from Pine Camp, New York. These men took on maintenance and support jobs that turned out to be so essential, commanders actually asked to hold off on sending them home after the war. Out in the fields, Italian prisoners used farming skills passed down through generations. They brought new techniques that boosted American agriculture. In canneries, shipyards, and depots, their work freed up thousands of Americans to head to the front lines. The Italian service units made it possible for American soldiers to fight instead of getting stuck in support roles. Thanks to their help, the draft pulled in fewer American men. The scale of it all was massive. By May 1945, the U.S. held 425,871 prisoners of the war, 371,183 Germans, 5,273 Italians, and 3,915 Japanese. Italian prisoners numbered about 51,000, scattered across 21 camps in 18 states. Their work added up to 90 million man-days and saved the U.S. $230 million in labor costs. They kept the harvest from rotting in the fields. 45,000 joined Italian service units, and almost nobody tried to escape. Many kept in touch with American families after the war, and quite a few came back as legal immigrants. Repatriation started in late 1945, but it dragged on. America still needed their labor to shift back to peacetime. Many Italians didn't want to leave. They'd found friends and opportunities here while Italy lay in ruins, occupied and hungry. When it finally came time to go, entire towns turned out to say goodbye. At Camp Hereford and other camps, local papers wrote about losing friends, not prisoners. People parted ways, sometimes with sweethearts, sometimes with close friends. Between December 1945 and July 1946, the Italians went home, taking with them first-hand knowledge of American democracy, farming, and industry. Back in Italy, they became unexpected architects of the country's recovery, using what they'd learned in captivity to rebuild. As promised, many came back to the US for good, sponsored by employers who valued their skills, by families they'd grown close to, or by Americans they'd married. They built businesses, especially in food and in trade, between Italy and America. They kept the two countries connected, smoothing the way for post-war recovery and commerce, and some became judges, business leaders, officers, and pillars of their communities. Their kids, raised with both cultures, became living bridges between Italy and America. You can still spot reminders of this story across the country. At Camp Hereford, there's a small chapel built by prisoners in 1945, honoring 5 men who died there. It's made of concrete disguised as marble, and now families visit it like a shrine. Bocce courts from California to Massachusetts trace back to Italian prisoners who brought the game with them. Italian festivals pop up in places like Texas and Utah, celebrating that legacy. Recipes shared by Italian cooks have become family favorites. But honestly, the biggest legacy is in the families and communities changed by this chapter in history. Businesses founded back then are still going strong now in their third and fourth generations. Sister city ties between American and Italian towns sprang from connections made during those years. Historians see all this as a rare success, turning former enemies into friends. This wasn't about propaganda, it was about experience. Italian prisoners saw American democracy and prosperity up close, and it changed them. Several things made it work. Italy's surrender in 1943 turned prisoners from enemies into co-belligerents. Italian-American communities helped build bridges. Shared Catholic faith created bonds. Italy's pre-war poverty made the prisoners open to new ideas. American kindness and abundance shattered fascist myths. Compare that with German prisoners who mostly clung to Nazi beliefs, and you can see the difference. Culture and timing mattered. The Italian prisoner story left a mark on both countries. America learned just how powerful kindness and opportunity can be in winning people over. Italy gained a generation ready to rebuild, armed with fresh ideas and hope. Former POWs did more than just survive their time in America. They built real bridges between Italy and the US that kicked off new trade and investment. They brought back American farming and industrial know-how, pushing Italian production into the modern era. But honestly, what mattered most weren't the technical tricks. These men carried home memories of democracy actually working. They'd seen it up close, and those memories became blueprints for Italy's post-war government. The whole program worked because it relied on showing, not preaching. Italian POWs watched American society in action. They saw a country that treated its enemies with basic decency and ran so smoothly, victory seemed like a given. They lived in conditions that made the wild promises of fascism look like bad jokes. By the 1970s, these former POWs started coming back to the US for reunions, not to relive captivity, but to celebrate the friendships and changes that grew out of it. At the 1988 Camp Hereford reunion, hundreds of old POWs and thousands of Americans who'd known them showed up. Veterans stood up to talk about how American kindness changed their lives, about how enemies had become family. They said captivity had been a stroke of luck. It opened doors to democracy, prosperity, and real human connection. At these gatherings, old men who'd once marched under Mussolini hugged the very guards who'd watched them. Their grandkids, American and Italian, ran around together, proof that reconciliation was more than just a word. So why did these Italian POWs call the American camps almost paradise? Not because being a prisoner was easy, but because those camps let them see a world they'd never imagined. They realized prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, that diversity made a country stronger, not weaker, that democracy, for all its mess, outperformed any dictatorship. They saw regular Americans living better than the Italian elite, workers driving cars, farmers using machines, factories churning out plenty. They got kindness from their captors, something their own government never offered. Compared to war, hunger, and propaganda back home, the camps meant food, safety, and a little dignity. Facing what waited in bombed-out Italy, America looked like hope. The Italian POW experience left a real mark on American culture. Pizza, now a massive industry, caught on partly because Italian cooks in those camps taught Americans how to make it right. Espresso, long before Starbucks, showed up in towns that had never tasted strong coffee. Italian festivals in little towns all over the country celebrate roots that go back to those years. And in Hereford, Texas, the annual POW reunion turned into a local tradition. In California's Central Valley, wineries started by former POWs or their kids make wine with old country techniques. Even the language got a boost. Thousands of Americans picked up Italian from the prisoners, and those language skills later helped with business and culture between the two countries. Italian words, especially food terms, slipped into local slang, and the impact wasn't just cultural. Beyond the $230 million in wartime labor, these POWs set up business ties that lasted for decades. Some became American citizens, others kept close business contacts, and together they helped drive billions in trade. The farming skills they learned in America helped Italy bounce back after the war. American industrial methods shaped Italian manufacturing, fueling the country's economic boom in the 1950s and 60s. American companies gained partners who understood both sides. Import-export firms, food companies, and manufacturers thrived because of friendships formed behind barbed wire. Psychologists noticed something remarkable too. Italian POWs in America didn't suffer the same emotional scars as many other prisoners of war. They had lower rates of depression and PTSD than Italian soldiers who never got captured. Why? Good treatment, purposeful work, real social contact, chances to learn, and the shift from enemy to ally after Italy surrendered. The effects rippled out to their families. Kids of ex-POWs often talked about how their dads remembered captivity in a positive light, rare for any war story. That attitude shaped family life and even changed how the next generation saw the world. The story of Italian POWs in America shows just how strange and surprising war can be. Men came in as Mussolini's soldiers. They left as believers in democracy. Enemies became friends. Prisoners became business partners, and in many cases became Americans themselves. Sometimes it's the small things that make the biggest difference. Sharing a meal, offering medical care, letting people worship, or making sure they could write home. These were the simple acts that changed everything. America turned its enemies into something closer to friends, not with propaganda, but with kindness. The Italian POWs saw America at its best, and suddenly they wanted that same kind of freedom and prosperity for their own country. Their time in America wasn't just about working in fields or factories. They brought new flavors and traditions, made Italian-American neighborhoods stronger, and created bonds between the two countries that still last. Their children and grandchildren, whether in Italy or the US, carry that hope for friendship and healing after war. The truth is, the Italian POWs didn't find their paradise in the camps themselves. It was the idea of what was possible, a society built on democracy and freedom. They took that lesson home, and it helped rebuild Italy after the collapse of fascism. In the end, 51,000 Italian soldiers captured in North Africa found in American captivity what Mussolini's empire never offered: dignity, opportunity, hope. They called it paradise, not because life was perfect, but because they caught a glimpse of what perfection could look like. Through their own transformation, old enemies became family, and two countries that once faced each other across a battlefield found real friendship. Their story is a reminder, even in the middle of war, humanity can win out. Kindness goes farther than weapons ever will. When you show people a better way, sometimes they follow. Most of those camps are gone now, turned back into farmland or swallowed up by new suburbs. But in Hereford, Texas, there's still a chapel. In California, you can hear Italian voices on the Bolchi courts. All over America, families trace their roots back to a soldier who found a new life in captivity and decided to stay. They came as fighters for a lost cause. They left as builders of something better. They arrived as prisoners, but they found something close to paradise. And because of them, two nations found a friendship that survived long after the war ended.